Girija Pande, Chairman of Tata Consultancy Services for Asia Pacific. Thank you very much for taking the time to fly out from Singapore to be with us. And if I may, I'd just like to start with a personal question. Tell me about your career. How did you come to your position of leadership in Tata Consultancy Services? And anything you would want to talk about, family, education, overseas experience, please go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here with you. When I look back on some of the milestones in my life and how one came to this position, I think there are 3 or 4 things that clearly are part of that journey. One is the fact that my father was on the civil service in India, so we moved a lot. For us, moving around was common. So, and in the same way, I have moved around in so many countries. I think it's part of that. So, educationally, I was an engineer. I did my mechanical engineering, and then I did my MBA from the Institute of Management in Ahmedabad. After that, I was with one of India's largest foreign bank at that time, Greenleys. I went with them. I worked in India in many areas, and then I moved on to Asia. Asia has fascinated me. I don't know, maybe I feel very much Asian. And I worked in Asia. I had opportunities to be in other parts of the world, but for some reason I always stuck to Asia. So I was in Korea, I was in Hong Kong, I was in Taiwan, then I went to Bahrain, then I came back to India, and now I'm in Singapore. So it's given me a great story on Asia. I have also witnessed through the 70s when I went out to now, the growth of Asia and the transformation of Asia. So I've been very lucky that I have been in the center of world's growth. And most importantly, I tracked China from the time I was in Hong Kong. And China was opening up in '84. And I remember going many times to Beijing when we set up our rep office there. And I was in charge at that time of our corporate planning in Asia Pacific. So Asia Pacific, the fact that I have worked there over these years when the transition has happened, the ups and the downs of Asia. Same thing, ditto with India after the '92 reform. So I think that has molded my thinking of where Asia's position will be and the leadership challenges of Asia. After I finished banking 25 years, I was the chairman of our mutual fund. I launched a mutual fund, the first debt fund in India. And I moved on to be an entrepreneur for a year and a half with a PE company. Because I was a very entrepreneurial person even when I was in the bank.
This was private equity
This
you
is
were
private
doing?
equity, yeah.
Yeah.
And at that time, TCS was also a part of that entity we created for wealth management. And then they requested that I set up and start the complete Asia Pacific operation, which was very small at that time. We had about 200 people in 4 countries. And today we have 7,500 people in 14 countries, including China, where we have about 1,100 people. So it's been a great story driving TCS's growth plans. We have 22 nationalities in Asia Pacific. We have local leadership. We have local customers and global customers. The past 4 years or 3 years have focused everyone's mind on Asia as the growth center led by China and India. So I think I'm lucky and fortunate to be in a situation or in a time when so much is happening in that part of the world.
Very interesting. You know, it strikes me, Girija, that you in fact, of course, have spent a long time in various parts of Asia, and you were kind of gathering your experiences in Asia much before the BRIC stories came out and before China and India in the last 10 years or so started to get talked about as these huge emerging giants in the future. Could you ever have imagined that the China story on one hand or the India story on the other would become globally as significant as they have become?
You know, in early 80s, I remember studying for a presentation I had to do. The bank was in those days part of Citibank. And our Citibank chief executive, then Citibank chief, was going to visit us in India. And as we were the largest foreign bank, I was to do a presentation which was going to look India 10 years, 15 years. So it's one of those blue sky presentations. And I looked at a lot of numbers and I looked at a lot of things and talked to a lot of people at that time to come to a I was bullish even then. I could see the demographic change. I could see the stirrings of early growth. I could see Indian companies getting better. And I could see the market and the size of the Indian market would be an advantage and not a disadvantage, as most of our politicians said about population.
Right.
And in 84, when I was in Hong Kong and I used to go to China, Deng Revolution had just started. He had just come to Shenzhen and said, I don't care the color of the cat as long as it catches mice. And Shenzhen was the place where it started. I saw the industrious nature of the Chinese businessmen, highly entrepreneurial, far more entrepreneurial sometimes than Indians are. And I saw this huge country with a cultural ethos of Confucianism, which would create the order that they need for development. And I was bullish about that. I have not been surprised. Yes, the BRIC connotation is newer and I think captures it better than what I thought.
So some of the foundations were already in place. It has become a much better known story. Of course, perhaps one could not have imagined the dramatic reforms of 1991 in quite the details in which they occurred, but that's a different story. So let's shift gears a little bit and start talking about your leadership style. And let's start with, in your leadership role in TCS, driving in particular the Asia-Pacific agenda, what would you say are some of the key priorities that you have as a leader?
See, Asia-Pacific, by nature of the entities that we have there, is a high-growth area. We had a blip in 97 when the Asian financial crisis.
The currency crisis.
But it has been steadily growing. So your priority will always have to be very ambitious growth plans. I mean, we have grown in TCS in Asia Pacific for the last 8 years under me at something like 35 to 40% CAGR. Annualized. And anyone who used to come from the outside used to tell me, are you sure this can work? And I said, this is how Asia works. If you don't do it, you won't get to a leadership position. We are starting from scratch. We were building from scratch. So A, it was important that we grew fast, and B, it was important we grew fast in line with the way the region was growing. And growth is part of the region's priorities for everyone, not only us. So that was one. The second was that we realized that customers in Asia were underserved. What a customer, whether it's enterprise customer or individual customers in the West have, they are used to levels of service which we did not have in Asia. We took shortcuts because maybe we were growing fast. So I instituted what I called a customer delight program in our organization for our key customers, where we would do more than what they would expect.
And was this relatively novel at the time?
This was relatively novel. We got very good responses. I was absolutely surprised because the underserved nature of the customers in that part of the world. So I think we have done, some of the priorities you talked about was to get customers sticking by delighting them. And lastly, customers in Asia, because of fast growth, did not actually focus on process and methodologies because they were growing so fast. Sometimes it was helter-skelter. So we started putting some process discipline around the business processes, around the IT processes. And I think that was the kind of organization that we were building with these priorities.
Very interesting. So let's deal directly with leadership style, and let's start with your leadership style. What adjectives would you use to describe your own leadership style? I know it's always a little uncomfortable to focus on oneself, but you're in a very sympathetic audience here. What adjectives would you use?
Right from the time I joined the bank and then TCS, I have been a dissatisfied entrepreneur. I used to say, a lot of people say that you have impatience in your DNA. I actually said inside large corporates, you can be an entrepreneur. You didn't have to be an entrepreneur outside.
Indeed. Yeah.
So there is an entrepreneurial streak of just doing things and being sometimes a little more radical than others, asking questions which people don't ask. So that is one. I think people know me for that, and I've built a lot of
dissatisfied entrepreneur.
Yeah, I have built a lot of new businesses when I was in the bank, and now, of course, in TCS. So it gives me great satisfaction. In fact, whenever someone gives me a clean slate, I love that role, and that's what TCS gave me. They said, the whole Asia is your canvas. So one is entrepreneurial style, which is obviously less bureaucratic, listening to everyone, challenging.
Let's get things done.
Challenging, conventional logic. I think we did that. So that is the first part, I think, of that. The other one is, I suppose, is something I learned from my father. You have to be a very fair person, but firm in disciplining when you have to. So fair but firm has been a policy of managing people. And I think people respect you if you're fair and open with them. But they also need sometimes a little bit of disciplining. And being an entrepreneur, delegation has come easy to me. I don't have all the answers because I'm creating new businesses. So you got to delegate. And I used to go and tell our people when I used to run treasury in the bank, I said, you got to get it 75% of the time right. You've done very well. That is a very powerful statement to your team, that you will tolerate failures. You'll allow them to innovate. Otherwise, they will wait for you for an answer. You can't have a prescriptive style. Because if you start saying that, they'll say, okay, tell us what to do and we'll do it. Yeah. So I think that's part of it. So open style, open door. My doors are always open. Everyone calls me my first name from the time I've been. Even though our average age in TCS is 27 years old. Some of them are younger than my children. And yet they call me by the first name. They can walk in anytime I like. So I think that's the kind of environment you've got to create for leadership, for being able to develop your people. More importantly, their ideas.
Now, we are talking, of course, to you at a time when you are literally at the peak of your career, and it has taken your entire career to get to this very privileged position that you are in today, making a lot of good things happen in Asia Pacific, having a lot of influence, not only at TCS, but the Tata's group. But there are always some experiences that are particularly meaningful in developing your leadership style. Were there such experiences, and can you talk about any one experience and how it influenced you as a leader?
I think all of us have role models as we've grown in leadership and taken new roles. Certainly, for me, and the difference between when I worked in UK sometimes and when I work in Asia was that in Asia, you have to be culturally very sensitive. The same thing that we say or do in the West is differently said and done in the East. So cultural sensitivity and openness to cultures. Whenever I went to a new country or a new organization in that country, I used to say that these are successful societies. Surely everything they do is not wrong. A lot of expatriates tend to have this view they bring from their home countries. I was very open-minded about accepting that culture and seeing the benefits and strengths of that culture. So the sensitivity of how you handle Asian leaders, businesses, is very different, I realized from day one, whenever I was in Korea, Taiwan, or Hong Kong. And I think that's been one of the defining areas of being able to manage multicultural workforce. If they see you culturally open, in fact, sometimes I get more critical about India than anyone else, but that I think is the experience that I have seen which builds a good leader.
Is there a concrete incident or experience that you can think of?
Well, I remember we were in Korea, my first role, and we had a lady who was being promoted after an exam. And all the men folk came to me and said, this can't happen. This is Korea. You've got to understand that, this is a very male-dominated society.
They did not want the woman to be promoted.
They did not want the woman to be promoted.
Very interesting.
And I was quite adamant, saying that, I can understand this. And then a little later, the woman came to me, who was very bright, very young lady, who said, this is the way we do things in Korea, and I will withdraw my applications.
And she did not want to be promoted.
She did not want
How about that?
And she said, the nail that sticks out gets hammered.
Interesting.
So I learned the Confucius way of looking at life.
Right.
how Asia does this in its own way, and how sometimes you have to understand the cultural impediments of leadership.
And what happened to the lady eventually?
She withdrew her application. She continued, and I think somewhere later she went off. But I believe when I hear about her, whenever I go to Korea, she's done very well, as it happens. Korea, I mean, this is the Korea in the early 80s. I'm sure it has changed over years.
Yeah. So still staying with the area of leadership challenges, there is a literature in management theory that talks about how even much more from your greatest successes, sometimes the real crucibles for learning and development, particularly as a leader, can be from your greatest failures. Can you think of any such crucible-like experience that really deeply shaped your own values and kind of was a defining moment in setting the foundations for your leadership style?
I was a young man in those days when I was given the charge for Middle East to run a complete investment bank and treasury operations in the Middle East. And I was a man in a hurry. And I realized that we were trying to do many things. I mean, I had open fronts on let's do this and let's do that in my enthusiasm. I was all of 34, I think. And then when we were trying to put it all together, whether the books were not written correctly, there were some losses in some of the areas, and we were all over the place. I was trying to just run faster than the organization, the systems that could cope with it, the people that could cope with it. They were all enthusiastic young people like me. And I realized a couple of things. I learned something. A, you got to focus on what really works. What is it that adds value to your work? You can take up many, you're going to open many fronts and everyone gets very excited about that. That is number one. Number two, if you don't get the whole system behind it, your victory can be very pyrrhic. You will not succeed.
Pyrrhic victory, yes.
Victory. So you need to have a much more stronger and stabler way. So I learned that growth has to be managed. It cannot be entrepreneurial all the time. This is where you learn and you control yourself. Yeah. So when I built Asia Pacific, while we were growing fast, this is something which was the back of my mind. Are we running ahead of systems to cope up with? Are we running ahead of people who can handle it? Are we just pushing for growth for no regard to it? Yeah. So for growth to be sustainable and profitable, you have to be very clear that you have the wherewithals and the focus. So we decided like in Asia, we said, okay, let's first focus on a few countries, let's first focus on a few customers. Then we go to the next step. Where did I learn this? The mistakes I made in Bahrain.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So it's almost a resetting of your own aspirations, rescaling of your aspirations in order to have a more realistic chance of succeeding.
That's right. I think you have to learn sometimes to, walk before you run.
Indeed, indeed. Still staying with your leadership style more broadly, what would you see as your greatest leadership strengths, and what would you say as some of your greatest weaknesses? And would the answer be any different if, in fact, we were to ask some of the people that have worked closely with you?
I don't think the answers would be, to answer the last question, would be that different, because I have been one of those who actually has been proponent of a 360-degree feedback. So I actually get a feedback.
And that creates the convergence. Yes.
So I know what my people think of me. But just to come on to the first one, what are the strengths of the leadership and the style? I have a entrepreneurial bent, and therefore there is a certain impatience and reluctance to follow rules all the time. Because I think some of the best ideas come from your most innovative people, and they need to be encouraged. So clearly, I act as a coach to my team. You can't have a prescriptive style if you're growing fast, because then they will ask you, you tell us, we'll do it. The minute that happens, you are in a prescriptive mode.
Very interesting.
You want to say, what do we think? This is the challenge. And there are ideas bubbling forth. You will moderate it with your experience. you will finally have the stamp on it. They understand that. But that is the open coach that you need to do to bring this team's best.
Would it be fair to say that if you were more prescriptive, you would also not encourage them to build their own capabilities and build?
That is true. And as you build your people and as you try to grow them, and that's been a great pleasure to see some of our people who worked for me have grown so fast, is that it allows them to grow, it allows them to think, and it allows them to be very engaged. You want an engaged team. You don't want a team which basically is waiting for you to give ideas. That, in my opinion, is the biggest disaster.
So one of your strengths clearly is this open coach-like leadership style. What would be some of the other strengths?
I think over years one has learned that you can be open, but unless you have tight numbers and metrics driven, you may not achieve the results you're looking for. It can generate into a lot of exciting things, but at the end of the day there has to be a metric driven approach. So my feet are firmly on the ground when I look at metrics. So everything we put down to metrics. We first agree what we should do, and those are where ideas come in. Then we say, okay, so we are going into this project, what do we expect? And these are the metrics that we will expect at the end of it. And I was telling you the story earlier on, when we were hiring someone senior, what is it that I finally will get and how will I evaluate what happened? So it's a metrics-driven approach. I think that, and where I think a leader has to really contribute, and that's where I don't think you can be that entrepreneurial and leave everything to your people, is setting the vision. That framework of the vision has to be your thinking. Once you put that framework, then leave them to do the rest of the painting.
And be there as a coach.
Put that canvas and put that framework, the frame around it. And then be a coach with them as they paint along.